Is there enough light on me?
A bit dark. You look like in an Irish pub.
Yeah, I guess this is the best I think can do. Let's see. Yeah, I think this is the brightest it can be. Anyway, I'll have to make do.
Ishika, shall I start?
Yep.
Yes, we're all set.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to the 11th edition of Wildlife Chronicles, a series of online talks conducted by the Center for Wildlife Studies. I will be your moderator for today's talk. I'm Nitya Satish and I work as Program Manager at the Center for Wildlife Studies. Before we start, I'd like to let everyone know that you've been muted on entry, and I'd like to request the audience to keep their audio and video off during the talk. We have allocated some time for audience questions at the end of the discussion. So if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat box and I will share them with the speakers. We have a really interesting talk lined up for you today on Asian elephant conservation and an amazing set of speakers as part of the panel. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Ahimsa Campos-Arciez, Dr. Varun Goswami, and Sreedhar Vijaykrishnan. I will begin by giving you all a brief introduction to each of the speakers. Dr. Ahimsa Campos-Arciez is a conservation ecologist. His research focuses on the behavior, ecology, and conservation of Asian megafauna, mainly that of elephants. He works specifically on understanding elephants' ecological functions, especially as seed dispersers, and developing science-based strategies for human-elephant coexistence. He is currently professor and principal investigator at the Southeast Asia Biodiversity Research Institute and Center for Integrative Conservation at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Dr. Varun Goswami is a senior scientist at Conservation Initiatives, a non-profit that he co-founded. Varun works at the intersection of ecology, conservation, biology, focusing on applied population, landscape, and behavioral ecology. He has studied elephants and worked towards their conservation through most of his career, which includes his master's and PhD research and efforts that have spanned the Western Ghats of South India to the heterogeneous landscapes of Northeast India. He is currently pursuing his passion at conservation initiatives, designing science-based conservation solutions for India's threatened wildlife and their habitats. Sridhar Vijaykrishnan is a research scholar at the Nature Conservation Foundation and currently a senior project associate at the Wildlife Institute of India. His work focuses on elephant behavior, especially in human-dominated landscapes and conflict situations. He believes in a multidisciplinary approach involving physiology, behavior, and demography, among others, to understand how elephants respond to conflict situations. He is also passionate about the historical and cultural aspects of human-elephant interactions in India. Sridhar recently submitted his PhD at the National Institute of Advanced Studies. Thank you so much, Ahimsa, Varun, and Sridhar, for being a part of this panel. Before we delve into the discussion, I'd like to request you all to speak a little bit more about your background and your work. Ahimsa, if we could start with you.
Yes, thank you, Nitya, and thank you, the Center for Wildlife Studies. It's a great pleasure to be with Sreedhar and with Varun in this panel. So I think you did a very good description of my background, just to say that I come from Spain, and I found myself studying elephants around 15 or 16 years ago by chances of life. And since then I have been working in Asia, working in South Asia. I did my grad studies in Sri Lanka. Then I moved to Southeast Asia, working in tropical rainforest in Malaysia, where I spent the last 11 years. And I have just moved to China, and I'm currently in Xishuangbanna in China, in a seasonal evergreen forest. So, and I have been working in different environments, and this has been very, very interesting for me to see the challenges of living with elephants, but how the context matters. So there are no things that there's some general things that we can expect, but also there's a lot of changes, and we should not take much for granted. I'm very passionate about many of the things that both Varun and Sridhar said. In particular, I'm interested in the interface between science, generating knowledge, capacity building, education, training people and getting more people to know how to generate and apply science, and then applying science. So then the policy and practice, how we need to uptake all this knowledge. So I think this is where really we can make a difference, and it's a very exciting role. And I think we're dealing with very complex problems, and my personal mission is to hope that by the end of this century, which I will not see, but I hope it happens, we still have plenty of wild elephants, tigers, rhinos, and all these animals in Asian forest.
Thank you, Ahimsa. That is the hope. Varun, if you could give us a little bit of introduction about yourself.
Yeah. Thank you, Nitya, and thank you to CWS for inviting me for this. Thanks for the really nice introduction about me. Basically, I guess I'll just add to that to say that one, I completely, agree with Ahimsa and follow a similar kind of trajectory in terms of believing very strongly in science-based conservation. So I like to do research which is very applied in flavor, such that it can inform conservation decisions. And a lot of my work has been focused on elephants. I started studying elephants during my master's. So in 2006 was when I was doing my master's research, where essentially I was photographing individual elephants. So being amongst elephants and identifying individual male elephants to look at what's happening with that segment of the population, because they tend to get ignored when you look at the overall population, because they are also specifically targeted because of ivory poaching. They also tend to come into conflict with people more often. So it's important to understand what's happening with that particular segment of the elephant population. And that really got me going into the elephant world, and I haven't looked back since. And I continue to work with elephants for my PhD, where essentially the interest was to look at spatial conservation planning for elephants in heterogeneous, complex conservation landscapes, and how essentially, like looking at different aspects, for example, how they use habitat in these kind of spaces, how like protected areas and community forests and agricultural lands play out in these kind of landscapes in terms of meeting their ecological needs. What happens with the interface between people and elephants in terms of negative interactions, and what drives those, and what implications those might have for the long-term population dynamics of elephants. So these are all things that finally feed into conservation planning for elephants at large landscape scales, and that's pretty much what drives me to continue to try and make a difference on that front. Yeah, so excited to be here. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Varun. Sridhar, if you could speak a little bit about yourself.
So, thanks, Nitya, and thanks to the entire team at CWS for inviting me to this panel discussion and to share the session with Ahimsa and Varun. We've all been in touch for a very long time, and just like the two of them said, largely it's this passion to apply whatever we study on ground towards conservation of the species that has brought all of us here. I've been very passionate about elephants since ever since I can remember, and that's what actually motivated me to pursue a bachelor's in forestry. And it was that the bachelor's time actually gave me a lot of exposure to, because the college itself was inside a forest, and that gave me a lot of exposure to watching and observing wild elephants almost on a daily basis. Then on, I went on to do a master's, during which I studied behavioral and physiological stress in elephants. And because largely I was kind of getting a grip that across various disciplines that people study, often behavior is one aspect that was less studied or less addressed, and I was always interested in elephant behavior, how dynamic elephant behavior is, especially in the context of human elephant interactions and elephants moving into human dominated landscape. And it was quite fascinating to see how well they were also or rather they are also adapting to various settings. So taking a few steps forward from my master's, I went and did my PhD looking at how elephants were responding to some of these changes in terms of their demography and behavior, more precisely looking at social behavior in female elephants for my PhD. So by and large, I think it's this passion for the species, and more importantly, try and understand how well the species is able to respond to these large-scale changes, and understanding those responses, and try and see how best we could possibly fine-tune this information and feed it back into conservation of the species. That has kept me going.
Right. Thank you so much, Varun. Let's start with thank you so much, Sridhar. Let's start with the questions now. You've all spoken a bit about your background and your work, but I'd really like to know, how did that interest develop? What triggered that interest in all of you to work on elephants throughout your careers? Varun, if we could start with you. Varun, you're muted.
Yeah, is that okay?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah, okay. Is that fine? Am I
Yes,
visible and audible?
yes.
Yeah, sorry for that. Yeah, so okay, so I guess I started quite early in terms of being interested in elephants. I think my grandfather, he used to be in the tea industry. He was a manager in different tea estates across Assam. Many of those were next to forests which had elephants. Let's say, for example, the Dihing Patkai Elephant Reserve that is today, or the Kaziranga Karbi Anglong Elephant Reserve. And throughout my childhood, I grew up hearing stories of elephants and being, whenever visiting my grandparents, being close to where elephants were and learning, from his experiences, which was really exciting for me. And I guess I was kind of always moving towards wanting to be a wildlife biologist or a conservation ecologist, and wanted to work in the field. And I started my career in 2003 with an opportunity I had to work as part of Dr. Ulas Karan's team, looking at tigers and their prey, setting up camera traps, marking line transects, and doing all of that, to understand the predator-prey population dynamics that he was studying. But it was also in an area, Nagarholi and Bandipur National Parks, that many of you are familiar with, which has pretty high densities of elephants. So one tended to interact and encounter and interact elephants fairly frequently. And I think that, I was always really intrigued by elephants and their intelligence and, the curiosity and the such social animals. It was just amazing to be with them. And so I was pretty certain that I wanted to continue to, I wanted to work on elephants for my master's. So when I was doing my master's at National Center for Biological Sciences in Bangalore, my research was, like I said earlier, was basically dropped me right in the middle of the elephant world, so to speak. I would pretty much be surrounded by elephant herds and photographing individual elephants, and the interactions that I had with elephants just made me more and more convinced that that's really what I want to do, and I'm passionate about like doing something about conserving these species. And like I said, I won't again talk about my PhD, which was at the University of Florida, but the kinds of things that I focused on there essentially, speaks to the fact that and my strong conviction that elephants are such an important and flagship species in terms of deciding conservation strategies and policies and all of that at the scale of large complex landscapes that we find them in. I think if there is one species which we were to consider as a flagship to try and conserve a variety of different kinds of habitats and ecosystems and all of that in the Asian context, then I think really elephants would be one of those species. And I think that really drives my passion to continue to work towards elephant-centered or centric conservation, because I love elephants, but I also want to try and contribute towards conservation of other wildlife that kind of share space with elephants in these kinds of habitats and landscapes.
Thanks, Varun. That's super interesting. Sridhar, how did this interest develop in you? What triggered your interest?
I think there's a lot of similarity with what Varun just said, because also probably because I'm from Kerala. The families had a long association with elephants, but primarily captive elephants. And, as I grew up, all the stories that I heard, including my bedtime stories, were all about elephants. Because there are, temples in the neighborhood, and we had quite a lot of land over there. People always used to bring elephants and keep them in our backyard. So I used to get to interact with elephants and their mahots. Even back then itself, they used to tell a lot about their individual idiosyncrasies and personality differences and so on, which really intrigued me. That, the larger understanding that this is what elephants do. You can't enlist 100 things saying this is what elephants do. The very next moment, it will do the 101st thing. So that kind of behavioral flexibility and, behavioral dynamic or rather dynamic behavior really intrigued me to study them more. I guess in my early days of my undergrad and or my school days and so on, I probably didn't know much about conservation science and so on. And back then, I actually wanted to be a veterinarian so that I could serve elephants, try and understand what elephants are suffering from, and then probably, try and understand them more closely. But then later on, my undergrads and undergrad really gave me exposure to various facets of conservation science. And then I went on to do my master's again, like Varun, at the National Center for Biological Sciences in Bangalore itself. So that's where I guess it all started from. By and large, so when I went on to do my master's, so I did my fieldwork in the Annamalai Hills, which is one of the most important landscapes for elephants. And I was really, intrigued by the kind of behavior that I used to see there. You would see elephants in backyards of people feeding on jackfruits and so on. These are all tea garden dominated landscape, and people would just stand there and watch and didn't have much issues with elephants then. So all the while, during the bachelor's or early days of masters, all that you hear about human-wildlife interaction is primarily about conflict. But then here there was one scenario where you're actually seeing something different. There were some kind of, neutral or positive interactions where people were fine with elephant presence. So what was really driving that? So that really kind of pushed me to go forward and try and understand this interface better. And I think that's what has kept me going on. And just to add on to what Varun was saying, so recently, so I've just started some work on a short project in the northern part of India, in the northwestern landscape. And there's this one area where we have been doing some camera trapping work to get elephants. I mean, it's outside the PA, it's not even a reserve forest, just a small bit of land where elephants have been frequenting. So just to get individual ID, we had put up some camera traps, and because we wanted to show how important that area is for elephants. And in about 15 days of camera trapping, we got hyenas, leopards, porcupines, and multiple other species. So just, in the name of elephants, people want to protect that landscape, but in turn, you are actually protecting a wide range of other species. So that way, Varun rightly pointed out, the whole perspective of elephants being keystone species and the charisma that they carry really helps in conserving other species as well.
Right. And I can relate to that because I grew up listening to stories about elephants in my childhood too, and that was how I got interested in this field as well. Ahimsa, is your story similar to theirs? How did your interest develop?
No, my story is quite different. And I will put it into three different moments. The first one is in 2004, by chance, by pure chance, I got the opportunity to go to Sri Lanka to do a master. I was planning to do something else in a tropical island in Japan, and suddenly there was some opportunity, and I just, overnight I found myself in Southeast Sri Lanka, looking at elephants, completely unexpected and exciting. So then that was the first step. And at some point in 2006, when I was finishing my master, I had a small eureka moment. Again, eureka moment in terms of understanding that not only we needed forests to protect elephants, but also we needed elephants to protect the forest. So then that idea that elephants are agents that play a very active role in forest dynamics. So then that moment in which I saw it, you can read it and you can, but this moment in which you suddenly understand something, that got me very excited, and I continued to my PhD to study seed dispersal by elephants to understand, how they influence forest dynamics. And a few years later, in 2010, I was doing my postdoc in Singapore, and I went through one of these crises that every postdoc has to go through, in which I was thinking, should I continue working in science? Should I quit? Should I go to the private sector? Should I go back to Europe, go to the US? And they were, the future was very unclear. And I began to have several job opportunities, and I remember feeling, I know what I want to do, and I wanted to go to Malaysia and to study elephants, and I had a very clear vision of what I wanted to do. And I realized that I just need to find someone willing to pay me to do what I wanted to do, and luckily universities can be very accommodating for these things if you teach and you do something else. But those 3 moments really define what I think is going to be my long-term career.
Yeah, that Eureka moment's a great one, that you don't have to just, it's not only about saving forests for elephants, but it's about saving elephants for forests as well. Thank you all so much. My next question is, you all work in such different landscapes. Ahimsa, you worked in many parts of Asia. Sridhar, you focused on the Anomalais and now the Northwestern India, like you said. And Sridhar, Varun, you worked in the Western Ghats as well as Northeast India. What do human-elephant interactions in your respective landscapes look like? Sridhar, if we could start with you.
So, like I was telling you earlier, I did my bachelor's in very close to Coimbatore in Tamil Nadu. And there, if you see the human-elephant interaction scenario is quite intense in terms of human deaths, for instance. It's a very small area. The entire forest stretch is all along the foothills. That's the ridge basically separating Kerala from Tamil Nadu. And the forest stretch that you have in Coimbatore is just along the foothills. And there's a lot of overlap. There are hard edges between the reserve forests and farmlands and human use areas, developed areas. So there were a lot of human deaths happening there. Even where my college was, elephants used to come and do a lot of crop damage. People used to get killed, and the kind of scenario that I used to see there more often, elephants getting chased haphazardly, or people getting charged at by elephants in crop fields and so on. So that kind of was completely different from what I saw later on during my master's, for instance, in the Anomalais. But I believe even in the Anomalais, for instance, it was very different in the early days. Like I still remember when I was in school, I used to collect these newspaper clippings about all these wild elephants, and I still have a book where I've stuck all these paper articles. And I still remember Valparai as a very key place because Valparai always used to feature. Valparai always used to feature on local television channels and local newspapers for being one of the hotspots of conflict in Tamil Nadu. But with a lot of intervention from the side of people like Anand and others, conflict scenario has changed drastically. That the percentage of loss because of elephant has come down significantly. So that kind of also raised positive attitude among people. So what I saw in the Anomalais later on was that people were fairly tolerant of elephants. When elephants were close to habitation, the forest department was proactive enough to respond and keep them at bay. At the same time, elephants also had their, in some sense, the right of passage. Earlier there used to be these indiscriminate drives of elephants whenever they were spotted in plantations. But then there was this change of attitude where people were, or the plantation companies were ready to have elephants in a particular area. Let's say if elephants are there, they would shift the workers to another area and continue harvesting on that side. So that really made me think differently about what I had seen. So then. After my master's, I also to work with the same team in our CF team in Anomalais. That's when I also got to experience two other landscapes. One was Thiruvannamalai in Tamil Nadu, and another was Hassan in Karnataka, were completely different. Like in Hassan, for instance, again, people getting killed was almost a regular affair, and in about 20 years, close to 55-60 elephants were removed from that landscape in the name of conflict mitigation. So that was extremely opposite to what I had seen in Anomalais. So now when I moved to the northwest of India again, the issue was with crop damage, but then again people seem to be fairly tolerant. But there's a lot of movement of large bull groups, individual 13, 15, 20 individual bull groups moving through human lives. So it's been completely different in 5 or 6 of these landscapes that I've had first-hand experience from. It's been completely different.
Thanks, Sridhar. It's really interesting to know that each place you've gone, you've experienced different things with related to elephants. Sridhar, also your voice is breaking a little. Could be because of a bad network connection. Varun, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, sure. So I think one thing important to recognize when it comes to human-elephant interactions or human-wildlife interactions more generally in India. And I think that's really one of the reasons why we still are able to sustain such amazing populations of large-bodied mammals in this country, despite having a population of 1.3 billion people, is that I think we've had a long history and culture of, social acceptance and tolerance of these kind of species. And I think this is really a strong point that we need to build on. I mean, obviously, like, increasing conflicts with such species can lead to erosion of these kind of sentiments and this sort of thinking. But it's really important to try and, where that's there, I mean, to try and kind of see, can we think imaginatively of ways in which we can try and, build or like strengthen that, or at least sustain that sort of tolerance that people have historically had for such species, and not have measures which kind of start to, like, make people think differently in terms of what they are okay with in terms of what's in their backyard. And I think from that perspective, my work and interactions that I've had with people with respect to elephants has been, I mean, it's obviously like a mixed bag. And I will want to say that, one can't rest on our laurels that, oh, India is such a tolerant country and therefore there's no problem at all. But one must recognize the nuances of these interactions that people have with elephants. Now, to give you an example, when I did my PhD research in Garo Hills, and I think it was something similar to what Sridhar was also talking about from the south, which is where when I was talking to one individual there in the landscape in Garo Hills, he was just telling me about like the jackfruit that the elephants had eaten. And I mean, and so he was talking and I was listening. And then he was like, but elephants come every year and they eat jackfruit, and and that's kind of like the usual norm kind of thing. And then so one thing that's really important is to not suggest an idea of conflict where there isn't one. I think that's really, really important. And so one tries, when we interact with people, stakeholders, we try and make sure that suggestive kind of interaction doesn't happen with people. I think they should be able to say what they feel about things. And when he went on, he was basically saying that he has enough jackfruit on his land and he gets enough for his family, and he didn't really mind so much that elephants were eating jackfruit from his land. But then again, there is a clear reality of elephants coming and raiding crops and people losing their entire year's worth of crops, and so that is a reality that we have to work towards and have to find ways and means by which we try and address that issue. The other aspect that I think, so this is the positive end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, I think from interactions that I've and what I've seen in, again, from Northeast India, I'll give you another example from Northeast India. I think we do have a lot of cases, and I'm not talking about cases where people are trying to chase elephants off their crop field because they fear that they might be losing their annual crop or something like that. But there are cases where elephants are on spaces which are not necessarily causing any negative, are not really having a negative impact on people, but yet people can form large mobs and start chasing elephants, and all that kind of thing also does happen. So I mean, there is the two ends of the spectrum, and I think part of that also, I would say, is I would kind of put the blame on the current social media frenzied generations of our current times, where people just want to go and get that selfie of chasing an elephant just to look, just for that sense of bravado, or just for that thrill or something like that. So those aspects are also there, but one must kind of try and understand what are the underlying factors and what are the deeper rooted factors that might be driving some of these things, and whether there are ways in which we can try and address them. And I think there definitely are. One has to remain positive, and I think there is still a lot of potential in India for elephant conservation. And I again will press home the point that rests a lot on the long history that we have had of cultural tolerance for such species and reverence for such species in our societies.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think one of our biggest positives is our historical cultural tolerance. And like you so rightly said, we really do have to continue to sustain that here. Ahimsa, would you like to add your bit to that question?
Yes, sure. So we're dealing with a very dynamic system. Okay, the socio-ecological interaction between people and elephants And we are two very complex, very flexible, very generalist species. So then by definition, we will adjust to the conditions. And Asian elephants have a continental range distribution or semi-continental range. So then they live in very different conditions. And something that I found very rewarding in my career is working in very different environments. So then working in a dry forest of southeast of Sri Lanka, where you have many people, many elephants, like a lot of people living with lots of elephants in mostly very rural environments with a lot of subsistence agriculture, massive conflict, but very high tolerance, and also in a way, a lifestyle that was somehow, adjust to that. Or it was of course, as development has been happening faster and faster, there are changes that are moving away from that kind of being used to each other. Then in Malaysia, what I experienced was a situation very different, with very low elephant densities, but naturally in tropical rainforest, much lower than Sri Lanka. Very low human density for the same reason. 100 years ago, there were very few people in those environments. And most of the agriculture is commercial. It's big plantations of oil palm and rubber, often managed by plantations, or they are big scale. And the conflict there was mainly economic, was an economic issue. The elephants are causing so much damage in terms of revenue from oil palm. And that's an easy place to be. I think that's a very easy problem to handle when your problem is financial. And where I am now in China is a very different situation. Very few elephants, very small population, but has been growing over the past 20 years. And is living in a place with lots of people and people everywhere. Very high tolerance. The local people here, the Dai people are very, very tolerant towards elephants, but there is no space for elephants. Basically, there is no way that we can allocate natural habitat for elephants. So elephants are living in highly human-dominated landscapes. Often they have learned to feed on crops only. So then just living in forest patches during daytime, nighttime, just feeding on crops. And they have lost fear to people. And compared with what happens in other countries, here people don't react against elephants. It's a matter of law enforcement, and people here don't have guns. It is out of the picture. No elephant has been killed in maybe 10 years because of conflict. So elephants here have the upper hand. Elephants are very comfortable in these landscapes. They know they can go wherever they want. They can do whatever they want. And you begin to have very fat, very big elephants that they are very, very comfortable. So then here the main issue is not economic. It's really about people's safety. People are very scared of elephants. Elephants kill many people. And then you see that in these cases, you cannot just come with the same template for solutions, because they are not going to work. So I think it's very important to understand the drivers of these socio-ecological interactions. And understand that this is a very nuanced and a very wicked situation, and there is no solution. You need to find ways to fit things together to kind of reduce the amount of conflict, but it requires a lot of compromising. It requires understanding, a lot of empathy to understand, how it feels living next to elephants, and also understand that elephants are the ones who are going to lose in the long term. So it's a complex problem, but for me, seeing these different contexts has been very, very interesting.
Thanks, Ahimsa. That's actually a very nice segue to my next question, because I was going to ask you all, what are some of the considerations that one should keep in mind while designing solutions or strategies for human-elephant coexistence? Because like Ahimsa pointed out, it's very contextual. Sridhar, if you could start with you.
Yeah, so Nithya, I think you've really set the context in terms of, bringing in the key term of human-elephant coexistence. I think it's really, time that we start thinking of it as human-elephant coexistence and not as human-elephant conflict, because at, some level of human-elephant interactions, again, could be economic loss, could be loss of lives. It is inevitable, unfortunately, in current scenario. So there is no chance that they are going to be able to bring the conflict down to zero. That is something that we need to acknowledge and accept. But the key lies in bringing the conflict or the kind of interactions that we have with elephants to a tolerable level. You bring it as low as possible and foster coexistence wherever possible. Now, one thing that I've seen is that invariably across various landscapes, the failure of several of these mitigation strategies, several of these conflict mitigation strategies, can largely be, put on the blind replication of techniques. Something that works in a landscape gets blindly replicated elsewhere, for instance. And when one is to plan for solutions or strategies to mitigate conflict or to foster coexistence, for instance, fundamentally there needs to be a lot of effort in terms of understanding the spatio-temporal dynamics of these interactions in each of these landscapes. And one of the most successful examples that I've always liked citing again and again is the Valparai case scenario, where the early warning systems has really helped in bringing down property damages and human deaths. Now, there's a lot of investment that has gone behind the establishment of the early warning system. It was not done overnight. There was a decade-long research that went behind understanding that the early warning systems could potentially be a solution there. And now, if you say that the early warning systems have been working perfectly in Valparai and go ahead and replicate it elsewhere, it may not work. So the key is in to just cite an example, among the 4 regular groups that we monitor in the anomalies in Valparai, one of the group never damages properties that have these hanging LED bulbs outside. So it's all locally improvised, for instance. And invariably, when we know that this particular group is moving through those areas, we used to just tell people that we just put LED bulbs, and somehow it seemed to have worked. So that said, if you say that LED bulbs are going to deter elephants and put it everywhere else, then you're probably going to be at loss. So the key point is that everything is site specific, and even your strategies or approaches to make these solutions have to be site specific. You cannot replicate these methods anywhere else. And the second important point, which needs to precede this strategization or the planning of conflict mitigation, is that there needs to be proper assessment of the ground scenario of these issues, whichever landscape that is. And it is only then that you can actually take this forward in terms of you blindly say that removing elephants from an area. Like, we have seen landscapes where people have been advocating removing elephants as a conflict mitigation option, but those are the very same landscapes where you also see huge turnover of individuals. So it's often not the same individuals that are coming there, which clearly shows that there is a huge influx from some neighboring populations. So if it is not a closed population, if it has influx, and if it has huge turnover, then obviously your capture is not going to be a solution. So every solution needs to have a clear base on the site-specific issues.
Right. Ahimsa, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, yes, I think I agree, and actually I like to use the same example of Valparai. So my key point is you need to know what problem you want to solve. So think again, this is a very wicked problem. There are many dimensions to it. And then in a place, electric fences can reduce the amount of crop raiding that can solve a kind of a subsistence agriculture issue or a plantation issue. But in other places, what you need to do is to reduce the amount of contact between people and elephants. In other places, maybe the way to go is to just provide compensations. And I think in most cases, you need to integrate multiple solutions. So what I found in Malaysia, my suggestion to deal with long-term promoting human-elephant coexistence is a combination of land use planning. You need to plan your landscape. And I think Varun was talking before about spatial conservation is really key. Second, you need to reduce the amount of contact in conflict and define what are your most critical elements that you want to reduce contact between both species. Then having compensation, having mechanisms to deal a posteriori after the conflict happens, in a way that they prevent the perverse incentives and that is fair and that is effective. And on top of that, understand the social dimensions. In some cases, maybe you can build up some tolerance. In some cases, doesn't matter the amount of tolerance, if people are having really very high cost for living with elephants, there is not enough work you can do to build tolerance in that situation. You need to really reduce the cost and bring benefits for people living with elephants, and if possible, distribute the cost, share the cost. So people like me that have been living in big cities for most of the last 20 years, I don't have any cost in living with elephants. It's very easy for me to be pro-elephant conservation. So we need to really find ways that is not the communities that are next to natural habitats, the ones that bear all the cost of conflict. So I think these are the difficult elements to integrate, but also always understanding what problem you have in your place that you want to solve.
Thanks, Ahimsa. Varun, I know you work quite a bit on mitigation strategies and measures. What would you like to add to this question?
I think I would like to echo, all of what both Ahimsa and Sridhar have said. I think it's really, really important to recognize that solutions are going to be and have to be context specific and must understand the various dimensions that are at play here. This is, like Ahimsa said earlier, these are very dynamic systems. The interactions themselves are also very dynamic. They are changing in time. Both humans and elephants are extremely intelligent and extremely adaptable species. And I think so we must recognize all of that. And I think that, one thing that I would just like to add here is that, when we talk about human wildlife conflict and conflict mitigation and management and all of that, there is this discussion that it's more a human conflict situation as opposed to a human wildlife conflict situation, because different people with different priorities are essentially at conflict with one another. Uh, while I generally, see value in what is said in that respect, I think it is also important to not lose sight of the elephant in the room, which is the elephant itself. And I think, so essentially many times when we're thinking of conflict mitigation and management, we're thinking of the social aspects, because clearly, I mean, if somebody loses their life or loses their crop, that is a big deal, right? But I think when we design strategies and solutions, we must not forget the ecological needs of a wide-ranging species that requires a large amount of food and water on a daily basis. And how do we try and find a balance between the people who live there, where they're sharing these spaces with elephants? How do we find a balance between their existence and the ecological needs of elephants? In some cases, depending on what the situation is, and I think Ahimsa is completely right in saying that what do we want in a particular landscape will determine to a large extent the kind of aspect that we focus on. Sometimes it might need to be about separating elephants from people, but again, for example, I would say there that it's in my opinion a much wiser strategy would be to actually try and keep elephants out of human spaces and agricultural lands, as opposed to keeping them in forests, because a lot of our fences and trenches and all that are being basically placed along the boundaries of forests, and that does not recognize the fact that these forests and our protected areas, at least in India, are certainly, much smaller than what is large enough to accommodate a healthy population of elephants. We don't recognize the quality of habitat within these forests and these protected areas. Is it like completely, run over by basically by invasive species, which then reduces the resources that are available for elephants? So in that kind of context, and generally being the kind of species that migratory, wide-ranging species that elephants are, they need to move over large distances, whether it is for food or whether it's for mates. So I think we must recognize that inherent trait of elephants is going to be there. So how do we find, I mean, even if we need to separate, elephants from people, it might be much, wiser to do it in a way where elephants are still able to move between habitats. Yet, the places where people live and where their crops are, those are secure. I mean, there are examples from Sri Lanka, for example, where temporary fences are put around paddy fields and other cultivated areas, which then are removed when the cultivation is done and elephants are able to move through. So then those are, more imaginative ways in which we still address the same issue. So I think that's just something that we should keep in mind. Apart from that, I completely agree with everything that Ahimsa and Sridhar have said.
I think it's a very crucial point that we have to keep in mind both people's needs and not forget about the ecological needs of the species themselves. You all worked on such different aspects of elephant ecology, behavior, conservation. So I'd like to focus a little bit on parts of your work. Varun, just to continue with you, you worked and you've looked at elephant movement in Northeast, right? Can you share some impacts on how movements impacted by human activities and how critical it is to understand elephant movement? Because you just pointed out that elephants do have to move long distances for resources and for to find mates, right? So could you share some insights on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, I mean, so I can't stress enough how important it is to try and understand and study elephant movement. For a species, for their kind of biology, I think it is a very important aspect that one needs to look at. And I think to give you some examples from Northeast India, we did an intensive photographic capture recapture survey to photograph individual elephants and then look at their population under a spatial capture recapture framework. This is basically a modeling framework that tells us what kind of population that might be there in a place, but it also tells us something because we're identifying individual elephants. It's also telling us how much these individuals are moving. And this was done in Kaziranga National Park in collaboration with the Assam Forest Department. And what it did provide in terms from the movement perspective, what it did provide insights on was the fact that elephants, were potentially moving up to 14 or 15 kilometers outside of the park to forested areas to the south of the park, which is the hills of Karbi Anglong. So now that then immediately speaks to the fact that if you're thinking of Kaziranga National Park, which is a very important park, it supports an abundant assemblage of herbivores. One mustn't forget the fact that it is part of a larger landscape, and the hills of Karbi Anglong have a very important role to play in terms of supporting elephants and other species that move out of the park. And this is actually then research that we've done have also shown, because Kaziranga is a place where the Brahmaputra River forms the northern boundary of the park, and there is regular flooding of the park, and that kind of necessitates, like obligatory, basically the elephants and other species have to move out of the park to find refuge elsewhere. And with respect to that aspect, what we found is that essentially elephants, when it was in the flood season, elephants were basically avoiding areas that had a strong human footprint, areas which had like high human habitation, and those kind of places were being avoided, and they were trying to go through more less disturbed spaces. Moment the floods happened, obviously, like you're under a lot more pressure to move, because the habitat that you're in is inundated and you need to find refuge elsewhere. And the choices then you have kind of change. And in that context, then we found that during the flood season, elephants were moving through human spaces a lot more than when they were not under the pressure from floods. And even in that context, when they were moving through, let's say, for example, tea estates, they were still kind of choosing areas that still had some woodlands or some bamboo and those kind of things. So even within an agricultural land use, you might have pockets of important spaces that need to be conserved. Now, these are all things that are talking about, okay, you have to think large in terms of landscape scale. You also have to understand the nuances in terms of the heterogeneity in that space, and how do you try and, like kind of fine tune that to meet the conservation needs. And just the last aspect is work that we've done in Garo Hills. We just published a paper which develops a new model, which essentially allows us to look at, just by collecting data, systematically collecting data on locations of where elephants have been seen, or their signs have been recorded, etc. Under an occupancy modeling framework, one can actually look at the persistence of movement to identify important areas that elephants are moving through. So that helps in, when you're thinking of that landscape and you're thinking about, okay, where do I prioritize my conservation efforts? We can kind of get at that, with, with data that can be fairly, easily collected in the field if it's done in a proper design. So I think that really builds a lot in terms of our ability to be able to think about these landscapes and conserving at that scale. And one last point that I want to highlight here is that, that work in Garo Hills also, allowed us to identify important entry and exit points from these source habitats. And a lot of these entry and exit points actually didn't coincide with, with identified and designated elephant corridors. So again, that highlights the fact that, I think putting fences just around the forest is not a good solution. I think it is a much better solution to have a strategy where elephants are not able to get to where people are or where their crops are, while still being able to move through these areas. But overall, just to answer your first part of the question, I think what we found was that, yeah, elephants were kind of negatively impacted by the human footprint, and they were trying to get to areas on the other side through areas that had lower disturbance and lower that kind of an impact. Yeah.
Thanks, Varun. This has been really interesting so far, and it's now time to take some audience questions, and we do have quite a few. I'll start with one that I'd included in my list of questions because I think it's really important. So from Pratyush Singh, apart from the work that the frontline conservationists are doing, how can a common man contribute to the conservation of Asian elephants? Ahimsa, if we could start with you.
I don't have a good answer for this. It is something that bothers me, because I think it's a place where conservationists, we are not being very clear. We tend to give very naive answers about what people can do. And in the last few years, it has made me think that maybe there is not much that an average layperson can do for conservation. And I'm sorry to say this, I think in other areas, like in recycling or in energy consumption, individual behavior can go a long way. In conservation, there are a few things that you do that stop from cutting trees or killing tigers or killing elephants. So I think there are a few basic things. Don't purchase any animal parts. That's out of the question. Don't get engaged in any illegal trade. Don't engage in activities that require elephants getting perverse incentives. So then don't go to bathe babies and stuff like that require babies to be in that facility. Be open to pay more taxes, so that there are fiscal transfers to those communities who, to create compensation schemes. Support politicians who support policies that are conservation friendly, but all these things are very long fetched. Don't lead into very tangible outcomes, right? So then I think we need to be clear that in conservation, top-down approaches are much more important. So then strong policies, law enforcement, those systemic changes can go much, much further than bottom-up approaches. This is my take, and I would love to hear from Sridhar and from Varun whether they have a better answer, because it's a question that we fail to answer properly in many situations.
Sridhar, would you like to add to that?
So I kind of agree with what Ahimsa just said, that, for a lot of these conservation efforts to actually get acted upon on ground, you really need a top-down approach. When it comes to, let's say, certain policies getting implemented, for instance, how much ever we do or try and do a bottom-up approach, unless it is top-down. And perhaps, unfortunately, it's because the system has largely been hierarchical, and the policy implementations have always worked that way. But coming back to that question in terms of how common people could contribute towards conservation, again, yes, I don't have a clear answer, honestly, when it comes to how common man can contribute towards conservation. But in terms of, I think a lot of with elephants, it might be a little tricky, but a lot of these citizen science initiatives, for instance, have helped a long way in terms of gathering, like eBird, for instance. It's a huge effort in terms of collecting data on several bird species, which has come from common man and helped a long way in mapping and mapping distribution patterns of several bird species. Perhaps there are avenues that we could explore at some point of time. Because, just to give an example, and like Ahimsa was saying, it might even be too naive to actually say that these are ways in which common men could possibly contribute to conservation. But like in the animal list, for instance, the early warning system, which is largely built upon an understanding of elephant movement patterns and recaptures or reciting records of individual elephants or elephant groups, has also benefited largely from local communities who have contributed towards elephant location information. So that is one way in which local people have really helped in conservation there. Like for instance, one aspect of the early warning system has been solely run by the communities, which is the alert lights, for instance. So these might be small ways in which people could contribute. Now, this has also helped us, like for instance, in the northwestern part of the Annamalais, in Nelliampati and adjoining parts of Parambikulam, there's one tusker that we've been monitoring for close to 7 years now. And, we have fine scale information on the animal's movement patterns without radio collaring that animal. And this has come only from local communities, jeep drivers, anti-poaching forest staff. So they contribute images of this elephant almost at least on a weekly basis, that in the last 7 years, we have got a clear idea of where this animal moves through. And when he comes into must, he comes to the foothills of the park. And a couple of years ago, the forest department, they suddenly encountered this musk bull, and there's always this, myth, or rather this thought process that they have, that musk bulls tend to be very aggressive. So they wanted to drive him back. And then we actually took this data that we actually collected from common people, saying that he comes to this part of the park only during must and stays here only for 20 days. Just wait it out for 20 days and see what happens after that. After 20 days, he was just gone. And last year and now he's actually using the same area. He's come into must. So last year and this year, we haven't had much issues with the forest department, trying to drive away the elephant and so on. So I mean, these are very small interventions, but I think such contribution from the side of the locals also contributes back to, okay, they also say like, oh, our elephant is actually going to that part of the park also. So kind of like people taking onus and having a positive attitude towards the species and so on, I think can go a long way in the on-ground efforts.
Yeah, I think citizen science and having local communities help out in monitoring these animals really do help. And like Ahimsa pointed out, even small steps like not buying animal products also go along. Varun, would you like to add your bit to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I have a slightly different take. So one of us should. So I think essentially, while the policies are top down, who makes those policies and decide on those policies is determined by everybody, the common man. I mean, we are all citizens of the country. We vote for people as to who comes and, into power and decides what policy. And I think, if there is, I mean, it might be a bit naive, but to say if people want to contribute, I think there are different ways in which you can influence or voice your opinion or your support or lack of support for different kinds of things that are being considered by the experts, by the conservation community, by all of that. You can influence that through social media. I mean, and there is variation in terms of the common man as well. There are people who come from different kinds of backgrounds and different kinds of connections, and obviously people can also influence policy at different levels in different ways through one-on-one interactions as well. I think the important or the key thing here is to how does like somebody who's not in the field really recognize which are the things or which are the policies or which are the aspects that they should support and which are the ones that they shouldn't support. And I think there maybe it's like we've been talking all this time that it is so context specific and it is quite difficult. How does somebody who's not professionally trained make that distinction between a good policy versus a bad policy? I think we must kind of go back to science in that respect and say that, okay, what is proper, strongly researched evidence tell us about something or the other? I'll give you an example of human elephant conflict. I think a lot of the times one hears that human elephant conflict in India is increasing because elephant numbers are increasing. But I will ask the question, what is the evidence at the scale of the entire country which says that elephant populations are increasing in a way where it is actually defensible in a scientific manner? I don't think that is there yet. It's definitely maybe true for certain populations in certain good habitats, but even there, for example, like work from the Nagarhole Bandipur National Park area in Karnataka, which is supposed to be one of the most productive elephant habitats, data for the last 20 odd years suggests that the elephant populations have been stable. They've been at a density of about 2 elephants per square kilometer since the early 1990s to now. So where is the evidence that they are increasing? And in fact, if you look at those spaces from my own personal experience, I find that, if you went there in November, December and did an elephant survey, and you went and did a survey in March, April, you might find very different results, because clearly that is again telling you that elephants are very wide-ranging, and they do, cover spaces that's not necessarily restricted to those protected areas that you're measuring their densities at. So I think, but what is happening at the same time is that elephant habitats are certainly have been diminishing across a large part of their range. We've just recently written the updated version of the IUCN Red List status of the Asian elephant, along with other colleagues. And the general evidence across 13 range countries is that habitats are declining. The distribution of elephant is declining, and potentially populations are also declining. And so what's likely to happen, because we have elephants are a long-lived species, is that people might be seeing them more often, just because the same individual that was potentially roaming around inside a forest is today more visible because that forest is fragmented. That doesn't necessarily mean that the populations are increasing. So unless we are certain that science supports the point that yes, these elephant populations are increasing, we cannot have policies that are aimed at trying to control their populations, or try and have ways in which we control their populations so that we can conflict can be reduced. So then I think the common man can contribute to that by saying, okay, yeah, where is the evidence for this? I mean, if there is evidence, then yeah, sure. Otherwise, maybe we may need to rethink some of these policies and strategies. And I think everybody can play a role. Everybody is a stakeholder in conservation, and I think they can contribute in ways. But of course, they need to be their opinions and where they turn to in terms of what they support and doesn't will be directed or be guided rather by experts who spend their lives in doing this kind of work and trying to understand systems and all of that. So if you follow the right kinds of directions, hopefully it will make a difference. I also just want to quickly add that there are other ways in which people can contribute in terms of whether there can be opportunities, like Sridhar touched upon this, in terms of volunteering opportunities, or even working with a conservation organization, getting your hands dirty in that sense. Or just as much it is important to pay your taxes and support the people who put in the compensation schemes. I think a lot of conservation NGOs are working towards elephant conservation in, let's say, in India, for example. And the NGO sector does basically depend on support financially as well from various kinds of people and agencies and all of that. And I think even small crowdsourced kind of funding kind of can also help certain small projects or small things which might make a difference in the longer run. So I think there are different ways I feel that people can contribute, certainly.
Thanks, Varun. We do have quite a few questions, and I was wondering if you all would be willing to extend by 10-15 minutes. Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Ahimsa, I know you had a short follow-up to the previous question.
So I agree in general, with minor disagreements, which are perfectly fine. I just wanted to add something that is a follow-up on what Varun said. A very good way to contribute to conservation is to identify small, agile, effective conservation organizations, okay? Small NGOs, groups of 5, 10, 15 people who are doing very good work. And I think both NCF and conservation initiatives, as well as groups like Rimba and MIM in Malaysia. And so these kind of groups, they're very, very sort of fun, but there are a small number of people doing good work. And I think supporting these small groups goes a long way, much more than putting a lot of money into big organizations. I think also the host of this webinar is another example of a good, high quality, a scale, agile, effective enough organization. So find people who you want to support, and just take some time to identify who is close to what you care for and who can do a lot with your support. That can be a very good way to go.
Very valid point, Ahimsa. I'll move on to our next question. And this is from Jeshuran Roshan. He asks, there have been many novel experiments of employing biological agents or components in the ecosystem like termite mounds, beehives, chilies, etc. to reduce conflict in buffer zones and boundaries. Have these proven to be successful, or are there any new ones which have proven to be successful? Sridhar, would you like to answer that one?
I think both Ahimsa and Varun would agree with me on this, that these chili fences and beehive fences and so on may not really be a great, successful conflict mitigation measure. In fact, as far as my understanding goes, most of the trials that people have done. This goes back to what I was telling earlier in terms of strategizing conflict mitigation measures, where you found that something works somewhere and you're just blindly replicating it. And these beehive fences are something that people have found to be working in parts of Africa. Now the setup is different over there. The species of bee is different, and so there's a lot of variation in what we are seeing in Africa versus what you're seeing here. I mean, to think about the simplest of things, bees are diurnal and elephant croplets are usually nocturnal in nature. So how is that going to work even? And with regard to these chili fences, again, I've seen forest department trying out ropes that are dipped in chili paste, tying them along all these agricultural fields, and once it rains, it all just gets washed off. And then there was also this experiment where chili powder smoke could deter elephants. And my colleague at NCF, Vinod, has this beautiful video of an elephant feeding in a chili farm in Karnataka. It was just picking and eating this chili plant also. So it's not like the capsicum oleoresin is actually going to deter elephants. So I think a lot of these experiments, it's nice to have many of these experiments, but also you need to really take into account the biology, the behavior, and the adaptability of the species before you go into the experiments. Maybe Ahimsa or Varun want to add upon to that.
Ahimsa Varun, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just agree with Sridhar. And the thing is that those kind of measures have very appealing. We all want them to be successful, and are very gullible to this kind of easy solutions, cool solutions. But we're dealing with a much more complex problem, and whatever approach we take has to be scalable, has to be able to work at a big scale, and not producing a kind of a very local short-term reaction, but something that really allows to have people and elephants in a harmonious way in the same landscape. And those things can contribute in some areas, but they are not silver bullets, and in most cases they fail, and they can be distractions. And I'm very concerned when I see people focusing too much on some very cool approaches, but that is more the cool factor than the effectiveness factor. So I think we need to be careful with that, not to fall for the coolness factor.
Varun, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think Ahimsa and Sridhar have just said it so beautifully. I don't think I can say much more, but to just say that I completely agree with them. I also feel that, what it tends to do sometimes, these cool kind of strategies don't really, achieve anything in terms of actually, mitigating or managing conflict, but it tends to potentially, I guess, I don't know, I may be wrong here, but it might, there is a possibility of it also changing the way in which people approach or view elephants, in that, you from a situation where, you were perhaps earlier having elephants, moving through those lands earlier. Now you are focused more and more on different ways in which to deter them out of there. Gradually starts to tend towards, perhaps can tend towards rather, what I was saying earlier, which is that you're gradually maybe less and less tolerant of having elephants there altogether. So I don't know if that is true or not, but certainly these measures that you've talked about, I don't think any of them have proven to be effective in any way. I think if anything, there was an experimental study that was done in Assam, and which was published a while ago, and where they found that if you used light without using accompanying it with sounds like firecrackers and other kinds of disturbances, then and you're not stressing the elephants out, then potentially that might have a stronger effect in terms of just directing the elephants away from the land. It doesn't necessarily mean that's a silver bullet or anything like that, but we've also seen, and I think Sridhar was also talking about this earlier, that depending on the context, if your objective is to try and reduce safety concerns that might be coming because of accidental encounters with elephants, perhaps strategically locating lights in certain places might help. But these are all very context specific things. And most of these chili fences and beehive fences, I don't think any of them work either.
Yeah, something very briefly. I just saw some analysis doing a review on effectiveness of human-elephant conflict mitigation techniques, and I was very surprised and quite disappointed to see that the most number of studies available for effectiveness is for beehives, and also the one that shows highest level of effectiveness, which is a bias based on what is being funded and what is being published. So we need to publish the other things, because otherwise we're going to generate a huge bias in what gets in the media, what gets funded, what gets the hype, and it's not necessarily what is most effective. So we need to be careful with that, and we need to publish, the effectiveness when it comes to this kind of interventions. We need to have data on effectiveness. Otherwise, we're just talking, and we don't have data to compare things.
Thank you. We have one last question, and that's sort of a follow-up to the previous one. Could you talk about your views on railway fencing that has been used as a mitigation measure? What are your views on that? I'll leave the floor open. Whoever wants to answer this question.
Daily fencing?
Railway fencing.
Railway fencing. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Sridhar, Varun, Ahimsa. Varun, would you like to go for it?
I guess I've been talking about this issue. I mean, generally kind of been, alluding to this issue, I guess, in some ways. So I guess I think we learned from Nadu National Park in South Africa that, railway fences might be a great way to separate elephants and people, and therefore reduce conflict. And because of which it's come up along the boundaries of some of our protected areas and forests in Karnataka in South India. And maybe certain other states are also considering it, is the general feel I have, or what I've heard. What we also kind of need to keep in mind here is that, like I said earlier, is it taking into consideration the fact that our protected areas are small, our forest patches are small, and the elephants need to be able to move from one habitat patch to another. We are seeing examples of it in the media of elephants trying to cross through these railway fences one way or the other and are dying in the process, and that's obviously not working out well. There is evidence from, so there are cases from Nadu National Park where these railway fences have come from, where they've been removing some of these fences to allow elephants to move from one habitat patch to another. So if we learned about something that was done 30 years ago there, we should perhaps also learn about what their experiences tell them about this particular strategy now. And I also want to just quickly point to the fact that not railway fences, but other kinds of basically electric fences in Sri Lanka, evidence suggests that that might be having an impact on the nutritional, the body conditions of elephants and the kind of nutrition that they're able to get when they've been confined to small forested spaces, where the resources might be heterogeneous and may not be even that good, and which is then can have an impact on their reproduction and all of those kind of things. So then, are we basically throwing the baby out with the bathwater? This is something that we really must ask ourselves and think about. Since, depending on what we're trying to achieve in certain key spaces, it might be very important to separate out elephants from agricultural lands and those kind of things. So maybe strategic location of certain kinds of fencing might be useful and important, but we have to be very clear about where they are in space. What is what are our data telling us about the location of these places? How is it going to interact with the connectivity requirements and the movement requirements of the species? And essentially, a paper that we published suggests that conflict mitigation and connectivity can be at odds with one another. And so we need to be able to find the balance between the two things, because while on the one hand we are trying to reduce the losses that people face, but on the other hand we are also trying to conserve our national heritage animal, which is an endangered species as well. So that balance is very, very important. And I think strategic locations, spatially, understanding the context and thinking about fences from that perspective, I think is very important.
Sridhar and Ahimsa, I see you nodding along with Varun. Do you have anything to add to that? Sridhar, I see you do.
Yeah, so just to add to what Varun just said, to borrow words of a dear friend and colleague, Dr. Prithviraj Fernando, who works in Sri Lanka, has worked for like 25 years on elephants in Sri Lanka. Something that we all kind of agree upon is that among the various threats that Asian elephants are facing today in terms of habitat loss and linear intrusions and so on, one of the major threats today is indiscriminate or unplanned mitigation efforts. And these fences are also in some sense an example of that. So if you're not, like Varun rightly said, if you're not going to delineate where your fences are going to be, it can be detrimental to the elephants, and it is counterproductive to conservation. And the example that Varun was quoting from Sri Lanka in 2006-7, they drove a large number of elephants into the Lunagaamvera National Park in southern Sri Lanka and fenced them off. And in the last 15 years, the population still hasn't recovered. So I was quite fortunate to go and spend about a month there with Dr. Fernando, and we saw that most of the elephants still have extremely poor body condition. Which clearly shows that competition has been really putting a lot of stress, nutritional stress on these individuals. And in addition to that, if you actually see, there's huge skewness in terms of the adult female to calf ratio, which means the recruitment rates have also gone down. So clearly your population is majorly impacted because of some indiscriminate mitigation measures. So yes, fences are good in some sense. If you're using fences to protect, let's say, your croplands, like Varun also said earlier, you need to keep the elephants out of your farmlands and not inside the forests. So if it is planned in such a manner, then yes, it is good. Otherwise, it really doesn't help in any way towards conservation, I personally feel.
Thank you, Sridhar. I think with that, we've reached the end of this webinar. I do apologize because we've run quite a bit over time, but the discussion itself was so interesting that I think we just had to. Thank you again so much, Ahimsa, Varun, and Sridhar, for being a part of this panel. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody in the audience did too. It was super interesting and a really insightful discussion. Thank you all to the audience for taking time off your busy schedules and joining us. We will have many such productive discussions for you all in the future, and I hope to see you all there. Thank you all once again.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.